this morning may look a little different. We're back to online, but we hope that you are still connecting with each other, are still connecting with God. And if you have your Bibles this morning, I'd ask that you would just turn to Psalms 86, 11 through 17. We're going to be looking at the Psalms this morning, and as you flip there, I want to ask you a question. Maybe there's a time where you can recall a time in your life where you have been divided, right? You felt divided. You felt, maybe you have felt you've been divided in an argument. Maybe it was an argument because of a belief, or maybe it was political, or you simply just saw things differently, right? At the end of the day, your opinions were separated. They were different. What comes to mind for me this morning as you think of times in your life where you felt divided, I'll keep it simple for you. Purdue. If you're a Purdue fan, you're oftentimes divided, and you've probably seen these around, or you've seen them on vehicles. I oftentimes see them on vehicles as a license plate, but it says house divided, and it has half of it a Purdue fan, half of it an IU fan. Or maybe you've seen it the opposite, where half of it's an IU fan and half of it's a Kentucky fan, right? It's a house divided. Maybe you've thought of borders, right? State borders, county borders. Maybe you've thought of borders that separate countries, but ultimately they're put in place to divide us, right? To draw a line and separate one from the other. This is a funny one I always get teased about, but oftentimes when I wear Nike shoes, with Adidas socks or some other brand socks. Maybe I'll wear an Adidas t-shirt with Nike shorts. You know, don't think anything of it. I'm sure you do the same thing too. But I got a nephew who tells me that I can't do that, right? You can't cross over brands. You're divided, right? You got to either be all Nike or all Adidas. If you're going to wear Nike shoes, have Nike socks. If you're going to wear Nike, shorts, have a Nike hat or t-shirt or whatever it may be. But you can't divide brands, right? That's what he used to always tell me. I'm not sure if it's the same anymore, but that's what I was told. And even if you go as far back to history, right? You can go back as far as even our nation's history and see that there are times where we've been divided. Even now, you can see different things that maybe you would say we're so divided on. But I think of, this, I'm a Western guy, so I think of the time, at least the era of the Civil War and different things. But I think of the Hatfields and McCoys. You know this family, and they became famous for this division that they had between each other. They kind of, I wouldn't say they welcome the fame, maybe, I don't know, but they kind of are known for this divide, this great divide between the two families. And what about the North and the South, right? You either one side or the other, but even in the Civil War, and you saw the North and the South, you saw families, brothers fighting against brothers, and siblings, and relation, all these different family members fighting against one another. But you may think of some others, and you may have some different examples, but the reality is we know what it's like to be divided, right? We know that this idea, and the reality for us is, even in the past, this division has been all around us from the past and even to now. And if we look around, it's really right in front of us. We're simply trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong. In the biggest moments in life, we have this natural tendency to carry with us a heart that is divided. Right? If you really think about it, in the biggest moments in life, and these are some big moments that we're facing, we have this natural tendency to carry within us this heart that is divided. What I mean most by this is we live with hearts that can become separated from truth. Right? We become separated from truth, and better yet, we become separated from God. We live with hearts that become broken and are pleading for help. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but if there's something that needs to be shared again this morning, it is this. If you're someone that feels like you at times can go back and forth, or you're wavering. I mentioned the teeter-totter effect, right? You kind of go back and forth, or you're wavering at times. I want you to know you're not the only one. Right? You're not the only one. And we're going to look at verses 11 through 17 of Psalms 86. But to understand this passage, and particularly verse 11, that's kind of the heart of this morning's message. To fully grasp what we should and realize what is written at this time, we have to look back at this psalm. We have to look at what this whole psalm is, the bigger picture of this whole psalm. And I think that you're going to see that there's difference. There's great wavering, I guess is what I should say. And there's this teeter-totter effect even in this psalm. Like the examples mentioned before, the psalmist too is divided. Right. This is the psalmist writing, and it's a prayer that he has orchestrated, and he's divided. He's wrestling. Even one commentary said this: and in spite of the wish that the psalmist might glorify the Lord's name forever, in verses 12, you'll see this. Praise dissolves to a plea for help just 2 verses later. And we haven't read it yet, but I'm kind of just getting us there. And if you when we look through it, you'll see that this plea happens just 2 verses later in 14. Whether or not this psalm was originally a single composition, it was written at one time. The movement from plea in verses 1 through 7 to praise in verses 8 through 13, and then back again to a cry of deliverance in verses 14 through 17 reflects the actual faith journey. I want you to understand this, that it's an actual faith journey upon which most of us find ourselves. Simply describing the movement from desperate hope to confident praise and back to pleading hope may by itself serve as good news for those who are discouraged that their hearts are so often fearful and divided. I said it last week that maybe you are here this morning, or you're just going through this season of life, this conflict. We're in this series of conflicts, and you felt divided. And you feel your heart just going back and forth from praising God to pleading to God to desperation for God to back to praising Him. And I want you to know that even the psalmist would say that's part of the faith journey, right? That's part of the process. I love the transitions in the Psalms because they give us hope. If anything, they give us hope. And I want to talk for a moment about the possibilities that division doesn't have to lead to, right? This divide that we experience, it doesn't have to lead us to discouragement. Oftentimes we think that if we're divided, we naturally become discouraged. It doesn't have to lead us to this discouragement, but ultimately we get to be a part of this movement and this process in our faith journey that leads us to hope, right? Hope in a more united togetherness. Right? It kind of brings us back to this united togetherness. And I guess for us this morning, if you feel divided, maybe you feel separated and wavering, don't be discouraged by it. Don't be discouraged by it, but embrace the process and possibilities of God's way, of God's love, and God's faithfulness. Like the psalmist who wrote this Psalms, may our prayer be like may our prayer be like this, right? Like this passage. Actually, it's a challenge that I have for you later, so I might repeat myself, but maybe you could just write this passage down, verses 11 through 17, and that would be your prayer. That's my challenge for us, is that it would become our prayer just for ourselves, right? Likewise, it would become our prayer. If you didn't catch it at the beginning, this is ultimately a prayer from the psalmist. He's written this. It's a prayer that goes from desperation to hope, and again, a prayer back to desperation. But it reads like this, and as I read it, again, just underline it, right? Circle words that stand out to you, right? How does it describe God? Circle the words that you feel like this passage best describes God. But it reads like this. Verse 11, teach me your way, O Lord. That alone will preach. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart to revere your name. I give thanks to you, O Lord, my God, for my whole heart, and I will glorify your name forever. For great is your steadfast love toward me. You have delivered my soul from the depths of the sea. O God, verse 14. Oh God, my enemy rises up against me. A band of thieves seeks my life, and they do not set you before them. But you, O Lord, are a God of mercy. You, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Turn to me and be gracious to me. Give your strength to your servant. Save the child of your serving girl. Verse 17, show me a sign of your favor so that those who hate me may see it and be put to shame. Because you, O Lord, had helped me and comforted me. David reminds us in times of division, in times of desperation, in times of great anxiety and fear, God is still God. God is still God. I hope that you found words to circle or words to underline, but if our prayer really is to live undivided, to like the psalmist writes in the very first verse, to have this undivided heart, right? To live undivided. If our prayer is to live undivided, then we must first look at our attitude. Right? Look at our attitude. Multiple times in these verses, the writer calls out and uses the word, "O Lord." Right? Then he follows that up by calling himself your servant. Right? He's speaking to, "O Lord." He's recognizing, right? He's recognizing where he fits in. He's saying, "O Lord," and then he calls himself by the word your servant. In the beginning, he says, "Teach me. Teach me." We see the attitude of the psalmist. Well, we see this attitude of humility, this humble attitude. And what if desperation, the one like we see here, was more of an attitude of unity than an attitude of helplessness? Think about this for a minute. What if the desperation we're seeing in this passage, this desperation that we see, is more of an attitude of unity than an attitude of helplessness? See, if we want to live with undivided hearts toward God or even others, we have to accept the attitude that is willing to learn, willing to ultimately be taught, willing to trust the process, and have an attitude that is the movement of faith which still praises God. I played a lot of sports growing up, and I had a lot of coaches. And I remember in high school, I thought about playing in college, and I wanted to just see what that would look like. And I went to a coaches meeting with a couple different college coaches. It was for soccer, and we were just able to ask them questions. We got to find out what is it that coaches look for in a student athlete. What do they look for? What kind of person and athletes are they looking for? And they obviously want them to know the game and to have knowledge. They all obviously want them to have good grades and carry themselves well, to stay out of trouble. But the number one thing that kind of stood out was they really desired players that were coachable, right? players that could be taught, and players that still realized they had a lot to learn, right? They had a lot to learn from the game, and so this was this number one kind of trait. They ultimately wanted these players that were coachable. Can't help but think about the attitude of the psalmist in this passage and think about how coachable he might be, right? He recognizes his need for God, then he praises God, and then he goes back to his need for God. But throughout this process, or this faith journey, right? This going back and forth, which it ultimately is a journey. You see that he's able to be coached, right? He's able to in this prayer, he's recognizing that he has a lot to learn. It's an attitude. It's an attitude that he embraces throughout this psalm. The next thing that happens when we're willing to be taught is then we begin to learn, right? Not only do we have this willingness to be taught, but we begin the process of learning. In verses 13 through 17, we see the psalmist describe God, right? He's cried out to God. He's recognized him as Lord, but then we start to see him in this attitude that he's able to be coached, right? This attitude that he has a lot to learn, that he actually begins to learn. And what I mean by that is we see him describe God. We see that not only is he willing to be taught, but he is also willing to learn. And here we see what he has learned. He says, "O Lord, you, O Lord, have delivered my soul. You, O God, are merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." He says back in verse 13, "For great is your steadfast love toward me." I kind of envisioned the Karate Kid for a minute. I know that's silly. But I kind of, in the Karate Kid, you see that, you see this movie and you see this characteristic, and you kind of see this character, this kid who's kind of getting bullied maybe, and you really don't know why, if that's the ultimate reason, but he's kind of getting bullied, and so he finds this neighbor, Mr. Miyagi, and Mr. Miyagi begins to teach him karate. But the lessons that he's kind of teaching him start out what you think are nothing to do with karate, right? And you know the famous wax on and wax off and all these different things that he was doing. And he's like, what does this have anything to do with karate? And then he begins to learn, right? The attitude of being coachable, right? He begins to learn that when you are coachable, you begin to learn what you're actually seeking. And here the psalmist is seeking out God, right? He's desperate to be saved, but he's also desperate for the Lord, right? You hear the way that he describes God. And so you kind of get this illustration a little bit that sometimes we don't always understand. Sometimes in our desperation, in our moments of need, we may miss or misunderstand what's really happening. But if we're willing to be coachable, then I promise that we'll be willing to learn. If anything, we gain a closer relationship with God, and we get to understand more of who he is. And I hope that that's our prayer too, just like the psalmist said, if anything, we have this hope in who God is and the way that he describes God. May that be the same way that we get to describe him, that he is steadfast, right? That he is gracious and merciful, and that he is Lord. Before all these things are mentioned in verse 1, it starts out by saying, "Teach me, O Lord." Sometimes in the process of faith, and I hate it too. I was listening to the song as I was mowing, Even If, and I'm like, I love that song, and I hate it at the same time. I'm not going to lie to you. Because it's like, man, it's such a song of faith. You know, in this process of faith, in these moments of desperation, we become desperate to learn more about God, right? I hope that in your darkest moments, in your most desperate times, you begin to understand how good he is, right? How loving he is and how faithful he is. If our prayer really is to have an undivided heart, to know the Lord, to embrace his faithfulness, then don't always mistake desperation for despair, right? Don't always mistake desperation for despair. Here, and I'm going to close and wrap this up, but here you see the psalmist despair to be saved, right? At some point you say, and even at the end of this, you hear him say, save me from my enemies, right? But also you see a servant, right? A servant desperate for the Lord, desperate to know the Lord and to experience His goodness. If our prayer really is to live undivided, right? And to live undivided and unseparated, right? To have a heart that is undivided, then we must recognize the desperation of needing saved and the desire in being desperate for God, right? And living for the Lord, right? It's this desperation to be saved, but it's also this desire to live for the Lord. Sometimes we look at the word desperate in a negative tone, but in reality, when we look through the Bible, you see in the most desperate times is when most people learned the most about God. Right? I think of Noah after he built the ark, and you see the flood happen, but I can't imagine that building the ark, Noah's like, Lord, what are you talking about? Right? You're going to flood the earth? What are you talking about? And it was this moment that Noah experienced that was probably the craziest moment ever. I mean, he just flooded the earth. But yet you see Noah on the ark, and I believe it's in that moment that Noah got to realize and understand the most that he ever did about God. You see David when Saul was trying to kill him, and they run into this cave, and David snips a little piece of cloth off his robe, and he could have killed him, but he didn't. He spared him, right? It was David's darkest moment. He's literally being chased so that he could die, right? Someone's trying to kill him. Yeah, I believe it was in that moment, in David's most desperate time, that he got to understand God fully, right? Jonah, after he was inside the belly of a well, right? He's running from God. He's running. And finally, a well comes. And I believe it was when he was in the belly of a well that you get to see him understand who God is more. Peter, when he denied Jesus 3 times. I think it was in that moment that he finally realized, like, you are Lord, right? You are Jesus. I've just denied you 3 times, and I'm desperate. You see Peter just go back and forth. He's telling the authorities, no, I don't know this guy, right? And you can tell he just doesn't know where to go and where to fit in, but yet when he denies Jesus 3 times, it's in that moment. I think it's John 21. It's in that moment that you see him best understand who God is. I think of the story of the fiery furnace. I love that story. This idea of the most desperate time, right? The king was throwing these guys into the fiery furnace because they wouldn't kneel, because they only worshipped God, and it was a time of desperation. It was also a time where they needed to be saved, but at the same time, it was a time where they desperately served the Lord. Division leaves us feeling desperate and separated. But praying for an undivided heart, a confident heart, leaves us with hope. It leaves us with understanding God more. It leaves us with peace. That's what we're going to talk about next week. The conflicts ultimately rob us of our peace. But when we really seek God, when we're desperate to be saved, but we're also desperate to serve Him, when our prayer really is to have an undivided heart, we get to know God more. I love this psalm because you see the psalmist calling out to who God is. But ultimately, he's leaving us and showing us this hope that we have. My challenge for us this morning is that we may know this prayer, right? Maybe throughout this week you pray this prayer. You pray all of Psalm 86. You go through it and you realize as the week goes on, you might go back and forth as well. You might have a day of praise, and then you might have a day where it's, Lord, help me. And then you might come back and He's answered that prayer and you say, oh, Lord, you're so gracious. And then you might have a day of, Lord, help me. But maybe you would better understand Psalm 86 and who God is this week. That's kind of my prayer, is that we would copy this passage down somewhere and learn more about who God is. Because when fear, anxiety, loneliness, despair want to make us feel divided and separate, may we never lose hope in who God is. A quote from a pastor friend of mine I saw over the week, it goes something like this: hope still wins, but hope is not necessarily pretty. It's by Joe Saxton, and I just love that quote. It says this: hope still wins, but hope is not necessarily pretty. Right? I think if there's one thing this Psalms gives us, this prayer gives us, is sometimes things aren't always pretty. Sometimes we're desperate. Sometimes we're divided in our hearts. We're divided in our nation. We're divided as individuals, as the church. But may our prayer be an undivided heart that leads to hope. Right? That leads to hope. When conflicts want to create an undivided heart, may we stand in hope because of how we've learned more about who God is. He is loving, merciful, faithful, gracious, steadfast in love. We're living in times where we are conflicted by a lot of things, but may our prayer be the same as Psalm 86. May we be able to move forward into each day knowing more about who God is. So when our hearts are conflicted and they're divided, our prayer could also be, teach me, O Lord, to have an undivided heart, to be confident in you, to know you, to know your steadfast love. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you again, Lord, for the ways we get to still stay connected, for ways that we still get to be with each other. God, I just thank you for who you are. I thank you for reminders like this psalm that teach us of your love, teach us of who you are, and that ultimately give us hope. Lord, when our hearts are divided, we can truly pray to you and call out to you, Lord, in desperation, but also in desperation as your servants, Lord, to have an undivided heart. When conflicts want to take us this way and that way, Lord, may our prayers always be to have an undivided heart. God, would you be with each of us? You know what what we're facing this week. You know what we have faced, and would you just renew our souls? God, would you fall fresh on our hearts? And would we be able to learn more of who you are? We ask this all in your precious and holy name. Amen.